Before we dive in, I need you to do three things. 1. Dim the lights. 2. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, hypnotic background hum. And 3. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is real history, but the kind they never taught in school. Tonight, we're cracking open a tomb that should probably stay sealed. A vault of forgotten roles, ancient professions so strange, so uncomfortable, so unpleasantly specific that you'll be glad your worst job was just answering emails or wearing a name tag. Because in ancient Egypt, people did jobs you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Now, before you get too comfortable under your blanket, let me hit you with this. There were people in ancient Egypt, actual, breathing human beings, whose sole job was to smell the pharaoh's flatulence. Yes, that's not clickbait, that's history. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of gods, gold, and gastrointestinal diagnostics. Let's begin. It's sunrise on the banks of the Nile. The mist still clings to the reeds. A crocodile blinks from the shallows. The air is thick with the scent of wet mud, cooking fish, and incense. But you, poor soul, are not a noble, not a priest, not even a peasant farmer. You're something else entirely. You're an odor judge. Your official title? Lost to time. Your actual function? Olfactory surveillance. You work in the palace complex, and your daily task involves kneeling at the side of Pharaoh's royal bedchamber, sniffing. Why? Because ancient Egyptian medicine, some of the most advanced in the world at the time, believed that internal imbalances could be detected through exhalations, sweat, urine, and yes, other forms of release. If something smelled off, it might mean a blockage in the body's channels or a spiritual disturbance that required ritual intervention, and you, unlucky noble of the nose, had to figure out whether the pharaoh's latest mint and lotus honey diet was working, or whether death was brewing in his intestines. You weren't a slave. This was a skilled position. They even trained you, probably with scented oils, animal waste, and the occasional necrotic fish for calibration. So next time you complain about your boss's coffee breath in a morning meeting, remember, at least you're not sniffing divinely sanctioned royal gas at sunrise. But maybe you'd prefer something less nasal. Let's take you to another chamber, one deeper, darker, and even more sacred. You are a liquor of statues. Again, yes, really, the job existed. Carvings of it survive. In major temples like Karnak and Luxor, massive statues of the gods stood tall, carved from limestone, granite, or black diorite. And these weren't just decorations, they were living representations of the gods themselves, containers of divine energy. Priests would bathe, dress, anoint, and feed these statues daily. But before a statue could be touched, it had to be ritually awakened and cleansed with your tongue. Why licking? Because according to temple protocol, the mouth of a god statue needed to be opened to receive offerings. The ritual, called the opening of the mouth, was usually symbolic, performed with special tools, but in some obscure versions of the rite, temple servants would literally lick the lips or surface of the statue to activate it. Stone, dust, sand, oil residue, pigeon droppings, all of it, directly to the tongue. You'd do this daily, on your knees, while the head priest chanted and waved incense, and probably judged your technique. Were you honored? Maybe. Were you deeply dehydrated and perpetually nauseated? Also yes. Let's leave the temple and step into something even darker, much darker. The tomb. You're not a tomb builder. That's too clean. You're not a grave robber. That's too obvious. You, my friend, are a professional mourn wailer. Your entire career is screaming on command. In ancient Egyptian funerals, especially for the wealthy or elite. Paid mourners were essential. You weren't just encouraged to show grief, you were expected to display it, loudly, dramatically, and publicly. So you, a woman of high cheekbone and louder lungs, were hired to cry. But not just weep, wail. You threw yourself onto the ground, tore your clothes, smeared ash on your face, screamed the names of the deceased again and again to wake the gods of the underworld. Sometimes you were even expected to channel the voices of the dead's ancestors, possessed by grief or by acting talent. It wasn't just theatrics. Egyptians believed that without proper mourning, the soul of the dead couldn't make it safely to the afterlife. So if you failed at your job, if you weren't convincingly devastated, you might doom someone's soul to eternal unrest. Pressure? Immense. Bonus? Some families even had auditions. If your voice didn't carry like a banshee over the Nile, you didn't get hired. Still with me? Good. Let's pivot. How about something a little more hands-on? You're now employed in a noble's estate, not as a cook, not as a gardener, but as something far more prestigious. You are a scribe of the royal enemas. It's exactly what it sounds like. Enemas were a regular part of ancient Egyptian medical care. Pharaohs, nobles, priests, all underwent ritual flushings to cleanse the body and spirit. They believed digestion was tied directly to cosmic balance. And the best way to reset that balance? A warmed reed, hollowed and inserted. But your job isn't to perform the enema. That's the physician's domain. No, your job is to take notes. You record the flow, the color, the texture, the volume, the post-treatment facial expressions, all of it, carved onto papyrus, then filed in the Royal Medical Archive. You are, in essence, the world's first gastrointestinal documentation specialist. And you have to write with a reed dipped in ink after watching a reed dipped in something else. These were not fringe roles. These were part of the backbone of Egyptian civilization. You were judged not by how much dignity your job had, but by how well you served Manat, the divine order of the universe. Whether you were sniffing, screaming, or scribing, you were maintaining balance between the seen and the unseen. And that brings us to our next segment, and perhaps the most bizarre occupation of all, the people who fed crocodiles. Because in ancient Egypt, some gods had very sharp teeth.
So, you've survived the gas sniffing, the statue licking, and the funeral wailing. Congratulations! That makes you more durable than most tourists wandering through the Valley of the Kings on a 110-degree day. But your work isn't done. Not even close. Because while the gods of ancient Egypt were many and varied, some were a little more demanding. And one of them had scales, teeth, and a bad attitude. Let me introduce you to Sobek, the crocodile god of fertility, power, and try not to get eaten. Worshipped in temples like Kom-Ombo and Fayum, Sobek wasn't just a symbol. He was present, often in the form of live, sacred crocodiles who were treated like divine royalty. And someone had to feed them. Guess who? You are now a crocodile butler. Yes, that's a real thing. Your job is to care for a live, full-sized Nile crocodile who lives inside a temple sanctuary. These creatures weren't chained or caged. They were pampered, bathed, perfumed, given offerings of food, mostly raw meat, sometimes honey cakes because why not, and treated like living avatars of a god who might bless your crops or bite off your hand. Every morning, you open the inner chamber. You light incense to let Sobek know it's breakfast time. You whisper a hymn. You gently lower the food onto a ceremonial slab. And then, in absolute silence, you back away, slowly, like your life depends on it. Because it kinda does. Oh, and here's the best part. When Sobek eventually died, which, yes, all sacred crocodiles eventually did, you mummified him with full honors. Embalming oils, linen wrappings, amulets for the afterlife, even a little crocodile-sized sarcophagus. Some tombs contain dozens of these mummified reptiles, a crocodilian family reunion for eternity. And guess who's organizing the seating chart? You. Now, you might think working with a literal death lizard is peak weirdness, but Egypt wasn't done, not by a long shot. Let's dive even deeper. The job title? Keeper of the Pharaoh's Sacred Urine. Let's sit with that for a second. Because when you're the ruler of the Nile Valley, son of Ra, heir to the gods, even your pee is important. In elite temples and palaces, bodily fluids of the pharaoh were considered sacred substances, infused with divine essence. That includes sweat, hair clippings, nail trimmings, and, yes, urine. These were collected, stored, and occasionally used in medical or ritual practices, which means somebody had to do the collecting. You carried a jar, a very specific jar, marked with hieroglyphs identifying it as royal property. Your job was to be nearby when nature called. No eye contact, no conversation, just swift, silent scooping. Storage was everything. The sacred urine had to be preserved in a cool, dark place, usually a special chamber beneath the palace. You logged every drop in a papyrus register. Day, time, volume, color. The priests used this data to assess the pharaoh's health, divine omens, and in some cases, anoint statues or sacred fields with diluted mixtures. You were essentially the custodian of divine byproducts. People didn't look down on you. They feared you, because you touched what no one else dared. You were both invisible and indispensable. And if you lost that jar, don't even think about it. The consequences wouldn't just be political, they'd be cosmic. But okay, let's say all this temple nonsense isn't for you. You want something earthier, something with fresh air. Great! Pack your linen satchel and head to the edge of the floodplain. Because your next job? Professional hippo listener. The Egyptians adored the Nile. It was their life source, their trade route, their personal Uber pool. But it was also home to one of the most dangerous animals on Earth, the hippopotamus. To us, hippos are cute and vaguely inflatable. In ancient Egypt, they were chaos incarnate, especially the males. They could overturn boats, crush skulls, and bite a man in half just for wading in the wrong direction. But they were also sacred. The goddess Taweret, protector of childbirth, was often depicted as a pregnant hippo with lion paws and crocodile scales. She was terrifying. She was divine. And she had a fan base. So while male hippos were hunted as dangerous nuisances, some were observed and monitored. Enter you, the hippo listener. Your job? Sit near the Nile, usually at night, and listen to hippo sounds. Seriously. You'd sit quietly in the reeds, sometimes for hours, and record their grunts, roars, and underwater snorts. You'd interpret those noises as signs. Was the Nile healthy? Was a flood coming? Were the gods angry? Was Taweret pleased? You were part biologist, part oracle, and part sleep-deprived bait. You weren't alone. Your team included scribes, priests, and occasionally soldiers. If a hippo approached too closely, someone had to fire a warning shot, usually a flaming arrow. You just had to hope the hippo didn't pick you first. Maybe you're tired of animals entirely. Understandable. Let's put you in a lab coat, sort of. Your new role: extractor of foreign substances from the mummification process. In other words, ancient embalming waste management. Here's the deal. Mummification was messy. Bodies were drained, organs removed, cavities stuffed with resin, natron, myrrh, and linen, and not all of it stayed inside. You were the person who inspected the leftovers, chunks of fat, fluids, bone shards, and soggy bandages that didn't make it into the final wrap. Your job was to separate the sacred from the trash. Sacred material had to be burned in a specific way. Anything that touched the corpse might retain part of the soul, called the ka, and you couldn't just throw that in a ditch. So you cataloged each piece, decided if it needed to be buried, ritually burned, or handed back to the family for ceremonial disposal. Think forensic pathologist meets haunted sanitation worker. You wore no gloves, you stood ankle-deep in natron slush, you worked with copper tongs and sometimes just your bare hands. You weren't thanked, you weren't noticed, but if you messed up, that spirit might not rest, and neither would yours. So you were careful, meticulous, and deeply, deeply over it. We're not done yet, because next you're headed into the underworld. Sort of. Your job is voice of the dead.
All right. You've survived the crocodiles, the sacred urine, and the undead leftovers. And yet the weirdest job of all? It's still waiting. Because in ancient Egypt, death wasn't a full stop. It was more like a layover. A very long, very bureaucratic layover. And someone had to guide you through customs. That someone was you. You are the voice of the dead. No, not a medium, not a priest, something stranger. Your job is to speak on behalf of a corpse. Literally. During funerary rites, especially for nobles and officials, priests performed elaborate rituals to ensure the dead could speak in the afterlife. They needed to declare innocence during the weighing of the heart, that divine trial in the Hall of Ma'at. But since the dead weren't known for great public speaking, you were hired to recite their lines. Yes, lines. A full speech. You stood beside the mummy. In some cases, you wore a special mask, often of Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalming. You adopted the voice of the deceased, repeating ritual phrases like, "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not killed unjustly." It was called the negative confession. 42 sins, each denied in front of 42 judges of the underworld. You had to know every word. Misquote a single line, and the gods might decide this soul wasn't clean enough for paradise. The stakes? Eternal damnation. And a very disappointed client. You were a funeral ventriloquist, the ancient version of a spiritual proxy server. And if you did your job well, the soul of the dead would pass through the gates of the Duat and become one with the stars. Not bad for a side gig. But maybe talking for the dead isn't creepy enough. Let's up the weirdness. You're now employed by a mortuary workshop. You're not the embalmer, the scribe, or the ritual singer. You're the person who stuffs spices into the corpse's body cavities. Meet your new title, Stuffer of the Sacred Openings. Catchy! Once the organs were removed, the body had to be filled, not just for shape, but to prevent collapse and odor. You used natron-soaked linen, resin, and crushed aromatic herbs like frankincense, cinnamon, or juniper. But you didn't just toss them in. There was an order to it. The throat, the abdomen, the nasal cavity, even under the eyelids, every placement had spiritual significance. Too much resin in the wrong hole? You might cause spiritual imbalance. Or worse, bloating. And let's talk about pressure. Not psychological, literal pressure. You had to stuff just enough to maintain the body's form without bursting the seams. If a toe fell off, that was your fault. If the face collapsed into a resin pancake, that was also your fault. The family would complain. The priests would complain. The gods would definitely complain. And all you wanted was a raise, or at least a pair of sandals without toe holes. Okay, let's say you've had enough death for one lifetime. You want a government job. Stable hours, good benefits. Well, guess what? Egypt had those too. Sort of. You're now employed in the Department of Sacred Animals. Your job? Royal Cat Funeral Director. Ancient Egyptians didn't just love cats, they worshipped them. Cats were associated with Bastet, goddess of home, fertility, and protection. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death. So when a cat died, it wasn't just a loss. It was a cosmic event. Enter you. You received the feline remains, offered incense, sang a hymn, and oversaw the full embalming process. Cats were mummified just like humans, sometimes better. Linen wrappings, painted masks, tiny sarcophagi shaped like curled-up kittens. Some were even gilded. Once prepared, the mummified cat would be placed in a temple dedicated to Bastet, sometimes in a catacomb filled with thousands of tiny feline coffins stacked like offerings in a divine warehouse. And families paid well. Their beloved cat wasn't just a pet. It was a spiritual guardian, a tiny, furry conduit to the divine. You were the bridge. You were also constantly covered in fur, surrounded by hissing spirits, and occasionally bitten by a mummified tail. But hey, beats hippo duty. Now, let's fast forward a bit. You're working in Thebes, not in the temples, not in the tombs, but at the royal court. And your job? Professional licker of papyrus scrolls. Yes, we're back to licking. Why? Because ancient ink was sensitive. Papyrus scrolls were fragile, and sometimes when new documents were being written, they needed a natural adhesive to bind layers of papyrus, soften old glue, or moisten dried pigments. That adhesive? Your saliva. Not just anyone's. Yours. Why you? Because you'd been specially trained on a neutral diet, mostly barley, lotus root, and herbal tea, to make sure your spit had the right consistency. You weren't allowed garlic or onions or beer. Too acidic, too smelly, too disrespectful to the gods of writing. Your tongue was a tool of statecraft. You were supervised by scribes, your moisture monitored. If your mouth was dry, you were sent home. If your saliva ruined a royal decree, you were dismissed, or worse, ritually cursed for insulting the god Thoth. Fun fact, Thoth was the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and secrets. And you, with your human mouth, were his unsung intern. But let's close this section with something truly special. A job so rare, so strange, it may have only existed in one place. The royal listener of dreams. In ancient Egypt, dreams were more than just brain static. They were messages, prophecies, warnings. Sometimes they came from the gods, sometimes from the dead, sometimes from your ancestors or enemies. And pharaohs had a lot of dreams. So your job was to listen. At sunrise, while the king sat on cushions beside his personal lake, you knelt with a papyrus scroll and stylus in hand. The pharaoh would describe his dream. I was flying over reeds. A lion wept beneath the moon. My teeth fell out and turned into gold. You recorded every word. You asked clarifying questions. How many lions? Which direction were you flying, clockwise or counterclockwise? Then you brought the dream to the interpreter of night visions, another court official who specialized in decoding symbols based on ancient dream manuals. But you were the first filter, the listener, the receiver. You didn't just transcribe, you advised, gently, diplomatically. If the dream meant doom, you suggested more incense. If the dream hinted at betrayal, you casually recommended a security review, all while keeping your expression as unreadable as the Sphinx. One wrong interpretation, and you might be accused of planting fear, or worse, manifesting the dream. So you chose your words carefully, you wrote beautifully, and you never, ever said, "Sounds like anxiety, Your Majesty." Next up, you'll be feeding the gods, sweeping cursed tombs, and writing secret codes no one was allowed to read. And yes, there will be bugs.
Let's say you've had it with urine jars and corpse cavities. You want prestige, a job with purpose, something meaningful. Well, too bad. Because you just got transferred to the House of Life, the sacred library temple where Egypt kept its most dangerous knowledge. Spells, rituals, curses, lists of the true names of gods. And guess what? You're not a reader. You're not a scribe. You're the scroll sealer. Your job is to lock knowledge away, literally. Some texts were too powerful to be read. Instructions on how to raise the dead, how to destroy an enemy with a clay figure and spit, how to open the mouth of a god statue with your own soul. These were written by high priests, stored in hidden niches, and bound with special thread soaked in cedar oil and bull's blood. You had to wrap the scrolls tight, chant a protective phrase, then apply a mud seal that hardened into a symbolic lock. No one could break it, except the high priest. If someone did, the scroll might bite them spiritually. Hallucinations, illness, madness. And if that sounds dramatic, remember, the Egyptian word for text was also the word for spell. Your job was to make sure no one accidentally cursed themselves with knowledge. No pressure. Need a change of pace? Great. Let's head to the Karnak Temple. Grab your broom. You're on floor duty. But not just any broom. You are now the tomb sweeper of the cursed hall. Catchy title. Terrible job. Your assigned space? A little-known chamber below a partially collapsed tomb reserved for disgraced priests, the ones caught faking omens or touching sacred relics without authorization. Their bodies were still buried, but the afterlife process was stalled. That chamber? Unfinished. And it's your job to keep it swept. Every morning, you descend the cracked staircase. It smells like bat droppings, scorched resin, and something that died twice. You sweep quietly. You never sing. You never whistle, because the last person who did vanished. You don't ask questions. You just push dust into a corner, whisper an apology to the dead, and leave a piece of dried lotus at the doorway as a peace offering. Nobody thanks you. But every now and then, a small coin appears on the ledge, or the broom sweeps itself for a moment, or the air gets strangely warm just behind your ear. You pretend you didn't notice. You sweep faster. Need something less cursed? Perfect. Let's pivot to food service, because you're now a divine dinner plater. Your kitchen isn't just a kitchen. It's a god's kitchen. You cook for deities who don't eat, and you plate food that no one is allowed to touch. Every day before sunrise, you roast meat, bake flatbread, grind spices, and pour wine into gold goblets.
you prepare a full 5-course feast for statues. You dress the plate with precision. Meat cut into triangles, onions arranged like the Eye of Horus, bread pressed with sacred symbols, not for flavor, for meaning. Then a high priest lifts the covered dish and offers it to the god statue in the inner sanctum. The god consumes the essence of the food, the spiritual aroma, the ka. The rest, taken away, untouched, and buried, or in some cases, redistributed to temple staff. Cold, a little dusty, slightly divine. You spend your life plating food no one eats, except maybe one time, just once, you tasted a bit of honey cake before offering it, just to check the spice blend. And later that night, you dreamed of a flaming ibis screaming in perfect hieroglyphics. You never stole a bite again. Okay, you're not a cook, you're not a sweeper, you're not a sealer. You're into animals, specifically insects. Congratulations, you're now a sacred scarab breeder. Yes, breeder. In certain temples, especially in Heliopolis and Thebes, scarab beetles were bred in captivity as living symbols of rebirth. The scarab, or dung beetle, was associated with the god Khepri, who rolled the sun across the sky every day like a celestial ball of dung. Naturally, Egyptians believed dung beetles were divine. So your job was to maintain a colony. You fed them, monitored their ruling habits, cleaned their pens, harvested beetle eggs, and yes, you were in charge of dung delivery. Not just any dung, sacred dung, sourced from temple oxen, stored in climate-controlled clay bins to preserve its spiritual nutrients. Once the beetles matured, the most symmetrical ones were selected for mummification, wrapped in linen, placed in tiny stone boxes, buried with priests or nobles as divine companions into the afterlife. You weren't just raising bugs, you were raising symbols of cosmic resurrection. Just don't get too attached. Beetles don't live long. And if they died prematurely, you had to record it in the beetle ledger and offer a prayer of apology to Khepri. Try explaining that job to your parents. And now, one more, possibly the strangest yet. You are now a waker of sacred statues. Every morning, before the first light hits the pylon walls, you enter the inner temple. It's silent, cold. You kneel. You clap 3 times, you sing a phrase known only to your guild, and then you wait. You're not just waking up stone, you're awakening a god's presence within it. You anoint Philips with oil. You offer breath, blowing gently across the statue's face. You press a cold piece of obsidian to the forehead. Then you back away. The high priest enters. He speaks the invocation. The statue is now alive. Temporarily. And for the rest of the day, that temple statue must be treated like a breathing, sentient being. Food, music, offerings, guard detail. All because you said good morning to it properly. If you miss a step, the god doesn't arrive. And if the god doesn't arrive, the crops fail, the river floods, the priests panic. So yeah, no pressure. Next, our final section, where we wrap it all up. Worms, gods, bread inspectors, and the one job that might still exist today. And yes, you've probably done it.
By now, you've been a statue licker, a gas sniffer, a sacred dung handler, and the unfortunate middleman between Pharaoh's dream journal and eternal cosmic justice. But we're not done.
because for every scroll sealer or crock wrangler, there were a dozen more behind the scenes quietly keeping the divine machinery of Egypt turning. And some of them might sound way too familiar. You are now the royal bread inspector. Wait, that sounds normal. Wrong. Bread was everything in ancient Egypt. It was food, money, medicine, sacrifice, bribe, offering, currency, and occasionally weapon. Those loaves were dense. Temples produced it in the thousands: barley, emmer, millet, date-sweetened, or beer-infused. But it had to be perfect. Your job was to check every single loaf for ritual acceptability. That meant no cracks, no mold, no misshapen tops. You inspected the crust for scorch marks. You sniffed for spoilage. You ensured the sacred scarab stamp was visible. If even one offering loaf failed your test, the ritual could collapse. Not only would Bastet be offended, so would the workers who relied on bread as pay. You walked a fine line between quality control and divine diplomacy. You were the Gordon Ramsay of grain-based theology. Bonus nightmare, you had to taste the bread during certain festivals after it had been sitting on an altar in the sun for 3 days. Still better than the Beatles, though. Next, the professional worm reader. Not worm feeder, worm reader. Egyptians believed nature held clues: bird flight, flood levels, insect patterns, and worms. If worms rose from the earth too early, bad harvest. If they curled a certain way, bad omen. If they died mid-wiggle, really bad omen. Your job was to monitor worm beds near temples and tombs. You recorded their behavior, consulted ancient texts, and interpreted their movements for priests or nobles. Some scrolls even included worm glyphs with meanings like betrayal in the north or plague by midwinter. You were nature's translator, the original bug tracker, and occasionally a scapegoat. Because if the worms said something ominous and the harvest still failed, everyone remembered your name. Now, a lighter role. Emotionally speaking, literally, you are the bearer of scented cones. In most Egyptian artwork, you'll notice something strange: people with white cones on their heads, like soft-serve pyramids. Those cones? Not decoration, not hat, not symbolic. They were real, made of scented fat, tallow infused with oils, myrrh, or frankincense, designed to melt slowly over several hours, releasing fragrance and softening hair and skin. Your job was to deliver, position, and manage the cones. At feasts, funerals, weddings, or temple events, you arrived with a basket of cones, each labeled by scent and melting rate. Some were quick melts for short ceremonies, others were slow burns for all-night affairs. You gently placed them atop heads, careful not to smudge kohl makeup or mess up elaborate wigs. You rotated cones mid-event. You wiped drips from brows. In many ways, you were ancient Egypt's spa technician/party planner. And yes, you occasionally got tipped with leftover cones. Ready for the final job? Here it is, the one role that ties it all together: the professional reminder. This isn't a joke, it's a job. You were a human alarm clock, life coach, schedule keeper, and guilt trip delivery system rolled into one. Pharaohs had them, priests had them, nobles had at least 2. You followed your assigned person throughout the day, whispering gentle reminders about tasks. Do not forget your morning prayer. Your left sandal is still in the other room. Your cousin is expecting a gift by moonrise. You promised the gods you'd fast. Step away from the fig pie. You were trained to speak softly, respectfully, but with enough urgency to be remembered. You were expected to memorize long schedules, manage time, and occasionally shame your employer with recorded omissions, written down and recorded to temple scribes if promises to the gods were broken. The earliest to-do list manager in history. You were in essence a walking notes app with judgmental eyes. And now, so are we.